First of all, Peter, I would like to start by acknowledging you for whatever it took for you to get here to this room. I know there was a lot of coordinating on our side, and anyone who knows anything about you is that you are extremely successful, so you don't need to do this. You don't need to be here and share your knowledge, but you're here, and for me that speaks volumes about who you are. And the fact that you're always adding massive value and sharing your knowledge when you honestly don't have to, it really says everything about you. So thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you. And actually, it worked out very conveniently because we arrived back from a cruise this morning in Miami.
It was perfect. It was like a sign, right?
So we were able just to drive up here, about 45-minute drive, and here we are. So it was very fortuitous that we happen to be in South Florida, coinciding with your event.
Yes, no, and I love that. Thank you. We appreciate it. So I want to start speaking about the American dream, because as Latinos, you have a room of mostly immigrants, right? About 90% of this room was not born in the U.S., and now we live here. And the reason why we moved here is because we want a better life, a better quality of life than the one that's offered in our home countries. Yet, with inflation, with the government spending, the American dream seems harder than ever. You, for us, and why we've given you this award is because you represent the American dream. You are a role model for us. So do you think the American dream is still alive?
Well, it barely. I mean, it's still breathing, but it's a lot more difficult to achieve it today, which is unfortunate because it should be easier. My grandparents came here as immigrants too, for the same reason. They were looking for a better life, and they came here with nothing, not even really speaking the language, no money in their pockets. But they didn't come here with any expectations of any help from the government. They came here to escape government. They came to America because of the absence of government. And the absence of government means freedom. Freedom is freedom from government. Freedom to work and succeed and pursue your dreams. And the reason the American dream was attainable was because the government stayed out of your way. But unfortunately, modern America is a lot different than the America that my grandparents emigrated to. Right? Now, people are looking for a handout. They're not looking for freedom. They're looking for free stuff. They want the government to provide them with all sorts of things. And the government doesn't have anything to provide. All the government has is what it takes. And so to the extent that it provides one person with something, it needs to rob somebody else of whatever they're redistributing. And in the process, they make the economy a lot less free, and they erect all sorts of roadblocks and barriers that make the American dream a lot less attainable. And unfortunately, as the problems get worse, you end up with a result like they just had in New York City in the Democratic mayoral primary, where the problems that government creates become so great that it opens up a window for a avowed socialist, communist, to come out and say, we've got the solution to these problems, even though they are the cause of those problems.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable what we're seeing. And because seems sometimes that there's no way out. So people tend to take a radical position when they feel like they can't breathe, right? Like there's no other solutions. So how should investors then today think about preserving wealth? We, of course, know gold is your main thing, right?
Well, it's not my main thing, but it's certainly something that I'm known for. Yeah. And people need to understand, what gold is, in addition to gold being the most useful metal that we have. It's used in so many things, but it's also been the best money that we've managed to come up with in the thousands of years that we've used money. Before we had money, we had barter, and barter is very inefficient because you have to have a confluence of needs, and money solved that problem. But money had to be the most marketable commodity, and that just happened to be gold. And gold has been protecting people from government-created inflation for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And, the price of gold today is around $3,300 an ounce. But what that tells you is how much value, how much purchasing power the dollar has lost. When the Federal Reserve was created, you only needed $20 to buy an ounce of gold. And that's how many dollars you needed to buy an ounce of gold about 120 years earlier, in 1789, when the dollar was defined by a weight of gold. That was the first coinage act of the country after we became a country. And next year we're going to be celebrating the 250-year anniversary of America. But when we first were established, $20 was an ounce of gold, and that was the case up until not only 1913, but up until the mid-1930s. But the reason now you need more than 100 times as many dollars to buy the same ounce of gold. Gold hasn't changed. It's exactly the way it was. What's changed is the purchasing power of the Federal Reserve notes, of the currency that we use, not the money. Gold is money, but the Federal Reserve notes, dollars, are currency. And so many of them have been printed, created out of thin air by the Federal Reserve, that you now need more than 100 times as many of their notes as you needed when the institution was created. And unfortunately, and all of this will be aggravated by the passage of the big ugly bill when they finally get it through. But the deficit spending that has been driving the Fed to create so much inflation to cover the costs. See, when you have the federal government spending $2 or $3 trillion a year more than it collects in taxes, we don't get all that extra government for nothing. We have to pay for it. And the way we've paid for it is through inflation. Instead of the government taking our money, they take the purchasing power from our money by just printing it and spending that. And the result of that is everything is more expensive. And one of the reasons why the outcome of the New York election was the way it was is because it was a campaign on the cost of living, on how expensive everything is getting. Well, that's because of the inflation tax. People are paying higher prices to finance government spending. Government is the sole source of all inflation. None of it is the fault of greedy businessmen or Putin or anybody else who they claim is gouging us on prices. It's the government that's gouging us. Right? They're gouging us by spending money, because all the money the government spends, and that's why when you talk about the new budget, the big ugly bill, it's a fraud when they talk about it as the largest tax cut, because taxes or the cost of government is not defined by taxation, but by spending. And since this bill will spend more money than any other previous budget, it is a tax hike, because every dime the government spends has to come out of the pockets of the American public. And either it does it directly through an income tax or payroll tax or a tariff, or it does it indirectly by creating inflation. But the thing about the inflation tax is it is avoidable to a degree if you own assets. And that's why the rich tend to be getting richer and the middle class and the poor poorer, because they don't own the assets that allow them to avoid inflation. But the people in this room, to the extent that you're investing, you really need to recognize how grave the inflation threat is and how much larger it's going to loom in the coming years. And that a lot of the investments that I think have provided a hedge are not going to work as well. I think the stock market is in a bubble, hasn't popped yet, but I believe the U.S. stock market is a bubble. The U.S. bond market was a bubble. That bubble has popped. We are in a bear market now in bonds. I mean, if you've been holding U.S. bonds, you have some substantial losses in your portfolio, especially adjusted for inflation. And the dollar is also in a huge bubble. And I think that bubble is in the process of popping. It hasn't popped yet, but it looks like it's in that process. We're now at a 3.5-year low or so against the dollar, almost at an all-time record low for the dollar against the Swiss franc. But it looks like it's about to crack. And if the Fed cuts rates, or when the Fed cuts rates, there's a lot of pressure now. Trump wants to, fire the moron so that he can put a different moron in there who will cut rates. But I think once we cut rates, right, long-term rates are going to rise. The bond market is going to tank.
And the stock market?
Well, and then the stock market could follow the bond market because the stock market is hoping for lower rates. But the Fed can't really deliver lower rates. It can manipulate short rates, but it can't control the long end. It was able to get away with quantitative easing and 0% interest rates in prior years because we had the cooperation of the rest of the world. The rest of the world was willing to loan us the money, warehouse our dollars, reinvest them in treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, and sustain our economy, sustain our budget deficits, sustain our trade deficits. But I think the willingness of the rest of the world to continue to subsidize the U.S. economy, I think, is going away, especially given the recent vilification of the world by the Trump administration. They're taking advantage of us. They're ripping us off. They're screwing us over. Okay, well, they're going to stop doing that. So they're not going to buy our bonds anymore. They're not going to buy our mortgage-backed securities. And they're not going to supply us with all these low-cost consumer goods for nothing, right? Which is what they've been doing. They've been taking our inflation and giving us their stuff, and then they've been propping up our financial markets. So I think when we start to cut rates at a time where inflation is already too high and headed higher, I think that's going to prick that dollar bubble, and then that's going to take a lot more air out of the bond market bubble. And then we're going to be in for a real financial crisis, because it's going to be a sovereign debt crisis and a dollar crisis that is much greater than the financial crisis of 2008, but worse in that there's nothing the government can do about it. There's no bailout, there's no stimulus, because the way the government bailed the U.S. economy out of the financial crisis that was also created by the government and by the Fed, but the way they did that is by printing a lot of money, creating a lot of inflation to reflate the bubbles that had popped. But when the loss of confidence is in the U.S. dollar and in the U.S. Treasury market, then it doesn't work anymore, because creating more treasuries and more dollars, when that's the problem, just fuels the fire. And so we're going to be in a massive recession that there is no government cure for. Any cure will just make it worse. And unlike, prior recessions where we get the benefit of lower interest rates, we're going to have a recession with higher interest rates and higher inflation. They just announced a couple of days ago, the Fed had, I think it was on Friday, actually, there were another stress test, and the Fed was saying, hey, all the banks failed. All the banks passed, right? All the big banks passed the stress test. Well, what they tested for was a severe recession, but during that severe recession, the Fed is able to bring interest rates down to zero, and interest rates go way down. And in that environment, the banks survived. Well, of course they survived, because they got that bailout. But what they didn't test for is what's going to happen, which is a severe economic downturn where interest rates go up, where inflation goes up. And in that environment, all those banks fail, which is why your portfolio needs to be invested the right way, right? You need to be invested outside the U.S. You need to be in value, dividend-paying stocks. You need to be in precious metals. You need to be in precious metals mining stocks. And you got to be a real investor, not just a speculator. We're here in a casino, and most people who are investing are really shooting craps at a casino. They don't realize they're just buying symbols because they're going up, right? But you have to look at the actual business behind those symbols. And Americans are vastly overpaying for the stocks they're buying. And in some cases, they're buying stuff that has no value at all. Like, if they're buying cryptocurrencies or they're buying Bitcoin, they're buying nothing. But sure, the price is going up, so people keep buying it. But that's not investing, right? People are going to learn that lesson the hard way when all this stuff collapses. But in the meantime, there are a lot of opportunities for real investors who want to protect themselves against inflation, against a weak dollar. Because you can look around the world and there's a lot of opportunity. This is a bull, so I'm not, I am bullish on the right asset class.
Gold, right?
Right, but you have to know. Yes, I'm a bull on gold because I'm a bear on the dollar. But you have to know where the real investment opportunities are, and I'm hoping rather to help your organization find them, so more and more people are on the right side of this, because there's going to be a lot of wealth that's going to be wiped out, I think, over the next 5 or 10 years. But a lot of that wealth is transferred.
For the next 5 to 10 years for this recession to happen?
Well, I think the recession is here. I think we've been in a recession, a stealth recession. I think that's why Trump was elected, because the economy is much worse than everybody claims. I just don't think it's been, revealed yet by the numbers. But if you remember the Great Recession, right, from 2008, we were in that recession for an entire year before the government or the media admitted that we were in one, because they went back for a whole year and they told us that all the numbers they gave us for a year were wrong. And they revised them all. And they said all these quarters of positive economic growth, they were actually negative. So, you can get bad data. And then years later, the government comes back and says, oh, sorry, it was all wrong. And, I think that's what we've been getting fed. We've been getting bad data. I think the people who went to vote in the last election, they weren't voting on some statistics. They were voting on their actual experience in the real world. And I think things have actually gotten worse. As much as Donald Trump wants to pretend that everything is booming since he's became president, I think the problems that he was elected to solve have gotten worse. And they would have gotten worse anyway. It's not like, okay, well, it's because we elected Trump. If Harris would have won, they may have been even gotten worse than they have gotten. But we're still going in the wrong direction.
It seems like we're trapped, and a lot of people think maybe digital currencies are the answer. I know you don't think that way, but I think that's the main reason, right? The system seems so messed up that's the reason why it's so popular. The Bitcoin and all these new things, because it's an alternative to the system, right?
Well, people think it's an alternative to the system, although now Bitcoin has become the system. I mean, Bitcoin is now being completely driven by Wall Street. Well, the government, too, in a way, is kind of pounding the table for Bitcoin, because now that's the Trump family business. They're now involved in cryptocurrency because it's all hype. So it's perfect for somebody who's a good marketer, who's a good promoter, because it's all a form. There's no substance behind any of it. In fact, you call them cryptocurrencies, but none of them are actually viable currencies, least of all Bitcoin. It actually has the least viability as a currency, because most of the other cryptos, to the extent that you actually use them for a currency, they're actually better in that they're faster and cheaper. Bitcoin is very slow and very expensive. But what people do with Bitcoin is they gamble with it. You buy Bitcoin because you expect somebody else to buy it from you at a higher price. I mean, I was just at a Bitcoin conference a month ago. There were 35,000 delusional people at this conference, many of them very smart people, because, they found their way to Bitcoin because they understood economics, they understood a lot of things, but then they just kind of like made a wrong turn and ended up in Bitcoin. Now, fortunate, a lot of them ended up making a lot of money on that because they got in a long time ago. The people that bought Bitcoin years and years ago, and I've met plenty of them, I know plenty of them who have made hundreds of millions of dollars buying Bitcoin really cheap. But the people who have bought Bitcoin in the last 2 or 3, 4 years, they haven't really made any money. Yeah, I mean, if you bought a big dip, you did okay. But I mean, if you look at the price of Bitcoin in terms of gold, and that's the best way to price it, because there's a lot of inflation, and they try to claim Bitcoin as digital gold. It's not, but let's hold them to that for the point of this that I'm making here. But Bitcoin is about 15% lower today, priced in gold, than it was almost 4 years ago when it peaked in 2021. And so people aren't making any money in terms, they could have just bought gold, but that's despite all the hype, unprecedented promotion, 11 Bitcoin ETFs, Super Bowl commercials, celebrity endorsements,
Fidelity,
influencers, MicroStrategy, all these other copycat Bitcoin treasury companies, the strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, massive hype. And Bitcoin hasn't gone up, hasn't made any money for anybody, because the real money, the real funding of all that hype, the whales who bought Bitcoin years ago, they're selling into all this. So all that's happening is the Bitcoin is being distributed from the people who got in early to all the people who are now getting in late. And this is a classic pyramid scheme, a Ponzi scheme. The people that are loaded up on Bitcoin now are going to lose a tremendous amount when the air comes out of this bubble and this thing just implodes. But, so if you're holding on to any of it now, I mean, you have an opportunity. While there are greater fools, you can get out, but you can acquire real assets, either income-producing assets. You can buy stocks, you can buy real estate, you can buy something real, or you can buy real gold instead of fool's gold.
Okay, I love that. So, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just want to ask one more question for the conclusion, and that is, some people might be listening to all this and feel a little bit pessimistic, right? Like, oh, wow, it seems like we're screwed over. So what's an empowering tip you can give all our investors here? Maybe something beyond the lines of, what do you think you owe your success to, right? What's that habit or that tool that made all the difference for you, so that we can take notes and hopefully we'll be as successful as you?
Well, I think for me personally, I kind of never lost confidence in the things that I believed in and the things that I knew to be true. And you're going to get a lot of criticism along the way. People are going to put up a lot of roadblocks, and you just have to work hard, and you just got to persevere and have confidence in yourself, and have confidence that you're right. And yeah, I mean, you are correct in that. I talk about a lot of the negative things, more so than the positive things, because it's the negative things that concern me, and it's the negative things that most people are not appreciating. But there are positive. I mean, there is a lot of positives, to the extent that we still have elements of capitalism and freedom in America. I mean, we're not, it's not horrible here. We still have the free market, what's left of it, that thrives despite government interference. We're still innovating. We're still inventing. There's still a lot of things to look forward to. I think that there's a lot of, progress ahead, and I think the future will be brighter than the past. But we're going to have to go through some difficult times to get there. And, and I think, we're at a crossroads, or we will be. And that's one of the reasons that I like to spend the time that I do, helping to educate people to understand the root cause of these problems and government's role in creating them. Because when this next crisis arrives, and as bad as it's going to be, again, just like the 2008 financial crisis got blamed on capitalism. And people today still think that was because greedy banks, we just didn't have enough regulation. And it wasn't a failure of capitalism, it was a failure of socialism. It was government, it was central banking that laid the foundation and created that crisis. And then what they did laid the foundation for the one that's coming. But there's going to be a lot of people who are going to claim in this country that this is proof that capitalism doesn't work, and that we need to completely reject it. We need to eliminate whatever's left of it, and we need to just be a socialist country where the government controls the means of production and distributes the wealth and does all, and just basically commands everything and tries to create equality or something. But we need to have a much louder voice to drown that one out, and to reject government, and to take that as a failure of government, and the solution being to dismantle government to re-empower freedom and capitalism. I mean, that's what they've been able to achieve after many, many decades in Argentina, where you have a real a president elected on that pro-liberty, pro-freedom, anti-government platform.
It's an economist.
And actually come in there and take a real chainsaw to government spending, to actually do what Trump pretended he was going to do. Milei actually did it, and I think a guy like Elon Musk, he was expecting a Milei, and he was very frustrated that that's not what he found when he came to Washington, and he left, with basically as if he left it was a failure, and now he's just out there critical of like I am. But he's got a good platform. He's got a big platform with which to vent that criticism, and hopefully more people are listening and paying attention. But it is possible that out of the ashes of this collapse, something could rise that's much more powerful. And we have now the potential technology from artificial intelligence and other things that we didn't have. I mean, America, and I mentioned that my grandparents came here, and we built America from nothing. I mean, we became the wealthiest country the world had ever seen, just based on a comparative advantage in freedom. Just because we were freer than everybody else, we were more prosperous. And if we could create that type of society, with basically no technology, imagine what we could do with that kind of freedom and modern technology. So there is a lot to hope for and to strive for. But I like to focus on these problems that everybody seems to be oblivious to.
Want to avoid, right? No, that's amazing. We are a very optimistic community, so we still believe we can accomplish all our goals and all our dreams. So we want to thank you for joining us, for accepting this award, the Torch of Economic Freedom, and we still believe the American dream is possible.
Espero hayas disfrutado este episodio y recuerda, si quieres ser un titán de Wall Street, debes desde ya empezar a diversificar tus fuentes de ingresos. Para eso está nuestro programa Titanes de Wall Street, para tener una carrera en la industria financiera con Latino Wall Street, certificarte y empezar a tener diversas fuentes de ingresos. Así que te invito a tomar acción y a convertirte en un titán de Wall Street. No solo tendrás estas oportunidades con nosotros y todo este aprendizaje, sino también te rodearás de titanes a nivel presencial. Siempre habrá la opción virtual, pero una de las cosas que incluye es el acceso exclusivo a experiencias presenciales, donde podrás estar codeándote con titanes de la industria y acelerar tu proceso. Así que nos vemos en Titanes de Wall Street.